sir. I just picked up some money from Western Union.
We got a call about a man out here asking people for money. You been bothering customers?
No, sir. I went in, picked up the money, and came back out. I'm not asking nobody for money. I can show you the receipt if you want.
Man, stop resisting.
All right, let me drop you straight into this one. Antonio Arnello Carter is standing outside a Walgreens in Valdosta, Georgia, talking to police with his hands visible. He's not yelling, he's not running, he's not reaching for anything. He's literally mid-sentence trying to explain himself. He says something like, "Sir, I just picked up some money from Western Union. I got my ID right." And before that sentence even lands, he feels hands grab him from behind. 1 second he's upright, trying to cooperate, trying to stay calm like everybody always tells you to do. The next second his face is bouncing off concrete. His wrist is twisted at an angle it should never be at. And all the air is punched straight out of his chest. All he really knows in that moment is pain, confusion, and a cop's weight pressing him into the pavement, like he's some violent suspect who just attacked someone. And here's the part that should already make you angry. A grown man, doing exactly what he's supposed to, just got slammed into the ground so hard, he ends up with a broken wrist. And he still doesn't even know what he's supposedly done wrong. Let that sink in. Now, let's rewind. Because Antonio didn't wake up that morning planning to get assaulted in a Walgreens parking lot. He's 46. He's got regular life problems like anybody else. Bills, family stuff, trying to keep up. On this day, he's just there to pick up some money through Western Union at Walgreens. That's it. No big plot, no scheme. He gets his money, steps outside, and he's minding his own business. Somewhere else in town, or even nearby, somebody calls the police about a man allegedly panhandling outside the same Walgreens. At pretty much the same time, there's also a notice out about another man who actually does have a warrant. So you've got two separate things going on. A complaint about somebody asking for money, and a completely different person with an active warrant. And then the officers roll up and see Antonio, middle-aged black man standing outside Walgreens, has cash on him because he literally just picked it up inside. They don't know him. They don't know why he's there, but they've got that call in their heads and that warrant in their system. Instead of starting with, okay, let's make sure we've got the right person, it's more like they see a black man in the general area and their brains just connect the dots however they want. Antonio, for his part, is trying to do what he's been taught his whole life. Don't escalate, don't argue, don't give them a reason. He's ready to explain, to answer questions, to show ID. He has no idea that one of these officers is about to skip right past, "Let's figure this out," and jump straight to take him down. And that's where the whole thing really starts. So we're back in that Walgreens parking lot. Two patrol cars pull in, slow but intentional. You know that we're already assuming something's wrong kind of energy? That's what they bring with them. They see Antonio. He's not bothering anyone. He's just standing there with the cash he picked up from Western Union, maybe checking his phone, maybe just waiting before he leaves. But he fits the easy narrative. Black man near the store has money in his hand. So they walk up like he's already suspicious. One officer goes, "Hey man, what are you doing out here?" Antonio turns, keeps his hands where they can see them. That's the first thing he thinks about. Show your hands, be calm. "I just picked up some money inside," he says. "Western Union. I got my ID if you need it." Now, that right there, that should have slowed everything down. He's not arguing. He's not refusing. He's not trying to walk away. He's offering ID before they even ask. That's cooperation. The officer doubles down. "We got a call about somebody out here asking people for money. You been out here bothering customers?" Antonio shakes his head. "No, sir. I went in, picked up the money, and came back out. I'm not asking anybody for nothing." Another officer hangs back a little, scanning him up and down. That's Officer Billy Keller. He's watching Antonio's hands, his pockets, his body language, like he's waiting for any excuse to decide this is a threat. The first officer asks, "Can I see that ID?" Antonio nods right away. He moves slow, like he's done this dance before. "It's in my wallet," he says. "Back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now, okay?" He literally narrates his own movement for them, again, doing everything that's supposed to keep this kind of situation from going bad. He gets the wallet, pulls out the ID, and hands it over. While they're looking at it, one of them starts asking more questions. "Where are you coming from today? You live around here?" Antonio tells them. Calm, straightforward, no raised voice, no sudden movements. Just a man answering questions because he's trying not to get hurt. They radio in his name, start checking him in the system. Somewhere in that process, they've already mentally tagged him as the guy from the call, or maybe even the guy with the warrant. They don't know that for sure yet, but they're acting like they do. And here's the wild part. Antonio's still trying to help them understand. He holds up part of the money he picked up. "This is from Western Union," he explains. "I can show you the receipt. I just walked out of there, man." He's literally offering proof. He's trying to make their job easier. And then it happens. While he's mid-sentence, somewhere between "I can show you the receipt" and "I just walked out of there," Keller decides he's done listening. Keller steps in fast, comes up behind Antonio, and grabs him across the upper body. Antonio doesn't even have time to process it. 1 second he's talking, the next his arm is yanked, his balance is gone. Then he's slammed down. His body hits the pavement hard. His wrist gets caught under him at a bad angle when he tries to catch himself. And that's where the break happens. His shoulder takes part of the impact, too, and his face hits the ground. All of that in one move. He's stunned, hearing shouting over him. "Stop resisting. Put your hands behind your back." He's already on the ground, already pinned, and they're yelling commands he physically can't follow because one wrist is twisted up, and someone's full weight is on him. And this is where I want you to remember something. He showed them ID. He explained the money. He offered to provide the receipt. He kept his hands visible. He's literally doing everything they tell people to do during a stop, and still gets treated like a threat. While Keller's forcing his arm back to cuff him and grabs his broken wrist, the pain hits him all at once, and he cries out, telling them it hurts, telling them he's not resisting. They don't stop. The cuffs go on tight. His shoulders burning, his face is scraped, and now he's officially in custody without a single clear explanation of what he's supposed to have done. All of this over a panhandling call and a warrant that isn't even about him. And at this point in the story, nobody in that parking lot, not Antonio, not the officers, knows that in a minute they're going to realize they've got the wrong man. So now Antonio's on the ground, face down, cuffs digging into his already broken wrist, shoulders screaming, cheek burning from hitting the pavement. He's trying to pull in air and talk at the same time. "I'm not resisting. I'm not resisting," he manages to say. "It hurts, man. My wrist. You're hurting me." Keller has a knee pressed into his back, holding him down like Antonio just tried to fight his way out of a robbery. The other officers hovering close, watching, still in that mindset that this is their guy. And here's the thing. Nobody is telling Antonio why this is happening. People nearby stop what they're doing. Someone at a car, somebody walking into Walgreens, they pause and stare. No big crowd speech, no shouting match, just that quiet shock of watching a man who was calm 2 minutes ago, now being bent up on the concrete. Antonio keeps asking, "What did I do? What did I do?" No one answers him in a straight sentence. One of the officers finally throws out a vague line. "You know what you did? We got a call on you." Keller keeps holding him down while the first officer steps away for a second, looking at the ID again, listening to the radio. You can feel the energy shift just a little. That "we're sure this is our guy" starts turning into "wait a second." Dispatch comes back over the radio with more details on the warrant. They confirm the name, they confirm the description, and that's when the problem starts to show. The officer squints at Antonio's ID, listens again, and you can almost see the realization hit. The information they're getting doesn't match the man they've got on the ground. He asks dispatch to repeat something, Then you get that half-mumbled, "Hold on," under his breath. Meanwhile, Antonio's still in pain, still pinned. "Man, I told you," he says, voice strained. "I just picked up money from Western Union. I ain't done nothing. Check the cameras. Ask the lady inside." He's trying to talk through the pain in his wrist. The first officer finally steps closer to Keller and leans down, low voice. "Hey, this might not be him," he says. Keller doesn't move right away. You can tell he does not want to hear that. "What do you mean?" he snaps back. "The warrant's for somebody else," the other officer says, a little louder this time. He glances at Antonio's ID. Name's not a match. Description's off. They're saying that guy might be somewhere else nearby. So let's pause here. They've taken a cooperative man, slammed him into the ground, injured his wrist, shoulder, and face, cuffed him. And now they're starting to realize they grabbed the wrong person. Antonio hears bits of this. "What you mean, might?" he says from the ground. "You got the wrong man. I told you that. I've been telling you that." There's this awkward silence. Nobody wants to say the words, "We messed up," but everyone feels it. The first officer finally says, "All right, let's get him up." Keller loosens his hold, but it's slow, like he still wants to prove a point. He hauls Antonio up by the arm that's already injured, making him wince hard. "Careful, man. My wrist is messed up," Antonio says. They stand him up on shaky legs. The officer with the ID looks him in the eye now, a lot calmer than a minute ago. "Look, you're not under arrest," he says. "We just had to check some things out." Not under arrest, that's what they're going with. Meanwhile, Antonio's literally standing there in cuffs, hurt, embarrassed, and being told this was just checking some things. He asks again, slower this time. "So why you slam me on the ground like that?" No real answer. Just another vague line. "We got a call, okay? We got a call. We had to make sure everything was safe." Safe for who? Because it definitely wasn't safe for the guy with the broken wrist. Finally, the cuffs come off. "You're good to go," the first officer says. "That's it? No paramedics? No. Do you need medical help? No. We're sorry, we made a mistake. Just, you're good to go." Like they didn't just slam him into the ground and hurt him over someone else's warrant and somebody else's complaint. Antonio looks at them, stunned. "So that's it?" he asks. "You just gonna do that and tell me to go?" One of them mutters, "If you got a problem, you can file a complaint with the city." And that's another classic line. They know most people are too tired, too scared, or too doubtful to even try. That line is not about helping. It's about ending the conversation. And that's where Antonio has to decide what to do next. Walk away and try to forget, or actually push back against a system that expects him to just accept this and move on. After a couple days, once the meds settle in and the shock wears off a little, Antonio starts feeling the second kind of pain, not just in his wrist and shoulder, but in his mind. He can't sleep right. His body tenses up every time he hears sirens or sees a patrol car drive by. Every time he has to use his injured hand and can't, he remembers exactly how he ended up like this. And that "you can file a complaint with the city" line keeps replaying in his head. He decides he's at least going to start with that complaint they mentioned. He contacts the city about what happened. He explains. He mentions his broken wrist, the ER visit, the pain he's still dealing with. The response he gets back is polite, cold, and vague. A form letter. Something along the lines of, "We take all complaints seriously. The incident will be reviewed internally." No acknowledgement that anything went wrong. They want it to sound like they're on it without saying they're on anything. Weeks go by. Nothing meaningful changes. No one from the department calls them to explain. No apology. No, "We're looking into this. Here's what we found." Just silence. And this is usually where the story dies for a lot of people. But Antonio decides to reach out to an attorney who handles police misconduct cases. They file suit against the city, the department, and the officers involved. The claims are serious: excessive force, violation of Antonio's Fourth Amendment rights, unlawful seizure of his person, and basically treating a cooperative citizen like a violent suspect without cause. This is the part departments hate, because lawsuits mean discovery. Emails, reports, body cam footage, witness statements, all that has to come out. The longer this sits on the table, the more the city has to ask itself a big question. Do they really want this to go all the way through a public trial? Or do they want to write a check and quietly move on? Eventually, they make their choice. They decide to settle. The agreement lands $350,000 to Antonio. Now, let's be real about what that means. On paper, that's the city essentially saying, we would rather pay this man $350,000 than have a jury look at what we did to him. They don't say the words, we were wrong, but money at that level is not a, we did nothing and we're just being nice number. It's them protecting themselves from a worse outcome. Along with that payout, there's another piece that comes out of this mess: the creation of a citizen review board to oversee complaints about police conduct. The city announces it as a step toward transparency, community trust, all the buzzwords. Basically, from now on, when people like Antonio say, an officer hurt me and no one is listening, there's at least a civilian panel that's supposed to look into those complaints and not just bury them in a file cabinet at the station. That sounds good on paper. It's better than nothing. But it's also not the magic fix some officials act like it is. Because here's the detail a lot of people miss when they just skim headlines about a settlement and a new board. The officers who did this to Antonio, including the one who slammed him, stay on the force. They weren't fired. They weren't charged. They didn't lose their badges. They just got added to the list of reasons the city had to cut a $350,000 check and set up a review board. So, yeah, Antonio gets compensated. Yeah, there's a new layer of oversight. But the same men who decided a calm, cooperative black man was a fair target for a hard takedown over a complaint and a warrant that didn't match him, they're still out there wearing the uniform, carrying a gun and a badge. And that's the part the narrator in me can't shrug off. The system will hand out money. The system will form boards and committees and hold meetings. But will it really remove the people who keep making the same mistakes that somehow always land on the same kind of bodies? Antonio's case ends up being one of those situations where the city pays, the paperwork grows. The policies get a tweak, but the people who caused the damage keep their jobs. There is some accountability here, but it's not full accountability. It's the halfway version. A check and a committee, not a clean slate. Antonio's case shows how dangerous that mix of bias and power really is. Two different situations, a panhandling complaint and a totally separate warrant, get mentally glued together, and the person who pays the price is the black man standing closest to the story the cops already believe. And yeah, the city paid. $350,000 is not pocket change. They also created a citizen review board, which is better than nothing. It gives people a place to go when they're hurt or mistreated and tired of hearing, "We'll look into it," from the same department that caused the problem. But here's the part you can't ignore. The officers who did this to him, they're still on the job. So let's be honest. This isn't full justice. This is partial accountability. That gap is the problem. Accountability has to be more than a payout, while the same officers keep patrolling like nothing happened. Because if the only ones who truly feel the impact are the victims and the taxpayers, what incentive is there for anything to change at the ground level? So here's what I want you to take from this. If you see stories like this and think, that could never be me, understand that Antonio thought he was just running an errand. If you hear people downplay these incidents, he must have done something. Remember, he walked away with no charges and a six-figure settlement for a reason. And if you ever catch yourself thinking, nothing ever changes, remember at least this much did. A man refused to stay quiet. He got his injuries documented. He pushed the issue with a lawsuit, and now his name is permanently attached to a case that forced his city to pay up and add a layer of oversight it didn't have before. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. All right, I'm going to leave you with this. What does safety really mean if the people who are supposed to protect you can hurt you, admit it with money, and still show up tomorrow in the same uniform? And how many Antonios are out there who didn't have the paper trail, the lawyer, or the chance to fight back? If you want more breakdowns of real situations like this, no exaggeration, no fake drama, just the reality of how power, race, and routine encounters actually play out, make sure you subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this story. Because the only reason stories like Antonio's don't stay hidden is when people like you refuse to look away.
Ma'am, I need to step inside, now.
Officer, I'm Judge Alana Whitaker. You do not have consent to enter. Do you have a warrant?
This is an investigation. We can do this the easy way.
The easy way is you staying off my threshold without a warrant.
Officer Derek Halverson stood on a quiet Maplewood porch with his shoulders squared and his voice raised, like the badge was a key. He insisted he needed to come inside immediately. He framed it as urgent police business, the kind of urgency meant to make people step aside without thinking. He added pressure in the same breath, consequences, obstruction talk, the usual intimidation moves. The homeowner didn't step back. She stayed calm, held her ground, and did something that made Halverson's confidence flicker for half a second, like he'd just realized the situation wasn't going to follow his script. Then a small detail changed everything. A phone camera light appeared across the street. Another angle followed from farther down. Quietly, without anyone shouting or intervening, the whole scene started getting recorded. Clean, time-stamped, impossible to misremember later. Halverson noticed, and his face changed in a way that told you he wasn't worried about danger inside the house anymore. He was worried about what he'd already done on the porch, because whatever he'd walked up there planning, it suddenly looked like he had picked the worst possible door in Maplewood to try it on. Where are you watching from? Country, state, or city? Drop it in the comments. And if you like story times, where intimidation meets calm boundaries and accountability actually kicks in, hit like and subscribe. Rewind a few minutes. In Maplewood, Halverson had built a reputation people didn't say out loud unless they trusted who was listening. Residents described him as the kind of officer who leaned on fear, especially with black residents, using threats and presence to force compliance first and justify it later. That night he arrived on a residential street, claiming he was working a narcotics investigation. He treated the urgency like it was evidence. He demanded entry as if paperwork was optional. But the homeowner didn't respond like someone caught off guard. She stayed measured and procedural, refusing to be rushed into surrendering rights. And while Halverson tried different pressure tactics, stepping closer, talking louder, implying consequences, something else was happening around them. The neighborhood was paying attention. Two neighbors recorded from different angles. The homeowner recorded too. No chaos, no crowd, just documentation. And in a moment like that, documentation became the real authority. Halverson could feel it. The porch had turned into a record. Every word, every threat, every step forward was now something that could be reviewed later by people who didn't accept "because I said so" as an explanation. That was when the final piece landed. Something about the homeowner that Halverson clearly hadn't anticipated when he came up the walkway. His posture shifted again, sharper this time. Like a person realizing he wasn't the one putting someone on the spot. He was the one being tested. Halverson tried to recover control the way officers like him usually did, by doubling down. He kept the pressure on, leaning into urgency and authority, acting like the homeowner was the obstacle instead of his lack of legal paperwork. He pushed the idea that refusing him would look bad, that cooperation was the safer choice, that he could make the situation harder if she kept saying no. But the homeowner stayed steady and procedural. She didn't argue feelings. She didn't match his volume. She kept the issue narrow. Without a warrant, he had no legal right to enter. And with each repeated demand from Halverson, the recordings became more valuable. Because intimidation only works when it disappears afterward. Here it wasn't disappearing. Two neighbors kept filming from different angles, and the homeowner's own recording captured his tone and her calm refusal in a clean timeline. That meant if Halverson later tried to rewrite the story, claim consent, claim a threat, claim something in plain view, there would be receipts. That's when Halverson made his first real mistake. He let frustration show. Not a dramatic explosion, just enough to reveal what was underneath the Investigation Act. An officer used to people folding, suddenly facing someone who wouldn't. The mask slipped in a way cameras love. Subtle, clear, and impossible to explain away. Then the turning point hit. The homeowner identified herself clearly as Judge Alana Whitaker, a U.S. federal judge. You could feel the power shift without anyone needing to shout. Halverson didn't suddenly become polite because he respected the law. He recalculated because he understood consequences. A federal judge meant oversight. It meant credibility. It meant his Bodycam footage wouldn't just stay inside a department drawer. It meant his "I felt threatened" shortcut wouldn't land the way it sometimes did. And he knew he was still standing there with no warrant. So he backed down. Not with an apology. Not with accountability in the moment. More like a retreat. Pulling his demands back. Stepping away from the door. Ending the confrontation before it became a career-ending clip. He walked off the porch and left. The neighbors kept recording until he was gone, because that's what people did now when they'd seen too much go unchecked. They made sure the ending was captured, too. And that night, the story didn't stay on the street. The footage moved quickly, shared in neighborhood groups, sent to local contacts, forwarded to people who knew how complaints actually got processed. The same night, formal complaints were filed. Not vague ones. Specific ones. Timestamps, multiple angles, officer name, narrative consistent across recordings, which meant the department couldn't handle it the old way. They couldn't call it "he said, she said." They couldn't quietly dismiss it as a misunderstanding, because it wasn't just a resident's word this time. It was documented conduct with witnesses and a homeowner whose professional role made the stakes impossible to ignore. By the next morning, the department had a problem it couldn't downplay. This wasn't a messy story with conflicting accounts. It was clean footage from multiple angles, time-stamped, showing an officer claiming urgency, demanding entry without a warrant, and trying to pressure a homeowner into giving up rights. The Bodycam and dispatch logs would either match the story or expose it further. Either way, there was no easy way to bury it. And because the homeowner was a federal judge, the usual slow walk tactics didn't make sense. The complaint wasn't going to get lost. The questions weren't going to be brushed off. The department had to respond like it expected scrutiny, because it did. Internal review started fast. Supervisors pulled Halverson's reports and compared them to what the cameras showed. They checked whether there had actually been a narcotics operation tied to that address. They checked whether he'd been sent there or whether he'd freelanced it. They looked at how he described the encounter afterward, because that's where patterns usually show up. What an officer claimed versus what evidence supported. Then the bigger issue surfaced. Once investigators started digging, the porch incident didn't stay isolated. Complaints that had previously been treated as unproven suddenly looked different when placed next to documented behavior. Stops that residents said felt targeted. Searches residents said felt coerced. Encounters where intimidation did the work that procedure was supposed to do. The review turned from one bad call into repeat behavior. And at that point, the department had two choices: protect the officer and own the scandal, or act like a department that understood liability, trust, and oversight. So Halverson was suspended and put under investigation, not as a symbolic move, but as a necessary one, because the evidence created a risk the department could measure civil exposure, internal policy violations, and a public record that made "we didn't know" impossible to say with a straight face. For the community, the shift was immediate. People who'd been afraid to complain before saw what documentation could do when it was clear and consistent. The story became a reference point, not gotcha content, but proof that calm boundaries plus recording could stop intimidation before it became something worse. And Judge Whitaker didn't have to give speeches or go on TV to make the point. Her role in the story worked like a spotlight. It showed exactly how an officer behaved when he assumed a resident had no power, and how quickly he changed when he realized the opposite was true. Halverson's career didn't end in that moment on the porch, but it entered a phase it couldn't escape. Formal investigation, scrutiny of past conduct, and a real possibility that the badge wouldn't survive what the record revealed. Once the investigation opened, the department's priority wasn't just discipline, it was containment. They had to answer basic questions fast. Why Halverson went to that address, what he claimed he was investigating, and why he tried to push entry without a warrant. With the porch footage already circulating, any gap between his written narrative and what the cameras showed would make things worse. So the review widened. Supervisors and internal affairs pulled prior incidents tied to Halverson and looked for the same markers people had complained about for years. Intimidation language, threats framed as routine, vague justification for stops, and reports that leaned heavily on officer discretion while offering thin facts. That's where the pattern became hard to ignore. It wasn't one misunderstanding. It was repetition. Similar complaints, similar tactics, and similar outcomes. Except this time there was clean documentation and a homeowner with legal authority who couldn't be brushed aside. Community response shifted too. Residents who'd stayed quiet started filing their own complaints, not because they suddenly trusted the system, but because they saw something rare, a moment where evidence forced the system to respond. Some shared dates, badge numbers, and past interactions. Others offered to provide footage they'd kept but never thought would matter. And inside the department, the pressure wasn't just public. It was legal and procedural. A federal judge involved meant the department had to assume oversight would be serious, and that sloppy handling could turn a personnel issue into a much larger problem. Halverson's suspension stopped being the headline and became the beginning, an active investigation that threatened his certification, his position, and the department's credibility if they failed to act. By the end of that week, the message around Maplewood was clear and practical. Intimidation worked best in private, and it fell apart in public. After the suspension hit, the department tried to regain control of the narrative. They issued careful, generic statements about a review and policy compliance, the kind of language meant to calm the public without admitting fault. But the footage made that difficult because people didn't need interpretations anymore. They'd already seen the behavior. And once a department is forced into a review under public pressure, the next battle is always the same, whether it becomes a real investigation or a procedural cleanup. In Halverson's case, it leaned real. Investigators started checking what he had claimed that night against what could be verified. Calls, assignments, any documented narcotics operation connected to that address. The wrong house detail became central because it raised an uncomfortable possibility. He hadn't been following a real lead, he'd been following a habit. At the same time, the older complaints gained weight. People who'd been dismissed before now looked credible in hindsight because the porch footage showed a consistent style, forcing urgency, using threats to create compliance, then relying on the fact that most residents didn't have the time, money, or influence to fight back. Judge Whitaker didn't need to campaign against him. Her involvement did something stronger. It removed the department's ability to pretend the issue was unclear. Her calm refusal, the clear recordings, and the fact that she knew exactly what lawful procedure required made the contrast obvious. By the end of the process, Halverson's situation stopped being an officer who made a mistake and became an officer whose pattern finally got documented in a way that couldn't be explained away. And that was the long-term consequence. His career wasn't threatened by one confrontation alone. It was threatened because the confrontation exposed everything behind it. As the investigation moved forward, the story stopped being about one porch confrontation and turned into a department-wide test. Because now Internal Affairs wasn't just looking at what Halverson did that night. They were looking at whether supervisors had ignored warning signs, whether prior complaints had been dismissed too easily, and whether procedure had become something selectively enforced, depending on who was standing on the other side of the badge. That's why the review exposed more than Halverson's behavior. It exposed how predictable his behavior had become. Residents described the same approach over and over. Escalation first, paperwork later. Pressure to comply. Then a report written to justify the pressure. And once those accounts lined up with the porch footage, the department couldn't treat them like isolated grievances anymore. Halverson tried the usual defenses, framing it as misunderstanding, claiming urgency, implying he was acting in good faith. But the recordings limited how far that could go. Multiple angles and clear audio meant the department couldn't interpret away the central issue. He demanded entry without a warrant and used intimidation to try to get it. So the consequences sharpened. His suspension held. The investigation expanded, and with it came the real career threat, findings that could lead to termination, decertification, and potential outside scrutiny if the department's handling looked like a cover-up. Meanwhile, in Maplewood, something changed that departments often underestimate. People started documenting more. Not out of paranoia, but out of pattern recognition. The community had just watched proof do what complaints alone couldn't. The lesson wasn't, everyone is out to get you. The lesson was, if it happens, preserve it. And Judge Whitaker's role became a quiet example of how to handle power. She didn't scream, she didn't chase attention, and she didn't bend. She stayed calm, stayed inside the law, and let evidence carry the weight. That was the lasting impact. Halverson's intimidation only worked when it stayed private. The moment it became public, it started falling apart, piece by piece, complaint by complaint, until the system had no choice but to confront what it had been allowing. By the time the department finished pulling records, Maplewood understood what the porch incident really was. It wasn't a random mistake. It was a moment where a familiar tactic finally met three things intimidation couldn't beat: clear legal boundaries, multiple witnesses, and clean documentation. The department's internal review didn't just focus on that night. It forced leadership to confront what had been tolerated. An officer treating narcotics like a shortcut word, using threats to manufacture cooperation, and relying on the assumption that most people wouldn't be able to fight back. That assumption failed the second the cameras came out. Judge Alana Whitaker didn't win because she was louder. She won because she was precise. She didn't let the encounter drift into emotion or confusion. She kept it about one issue, no warrant, no entry, and let the recordings preserve everything else. And Halverson's retreat told the real truth. He wasn't confident in his legal footing. He was confident in people being too scared to challenge him. Once the footage spread, the complaints didn't feel like whispers anymore. They became a file, a pattern, a risk the department could no longer ignore without exposing itself. His suspension and investigation weren't just about punishing one officer. They were about the department trying to prove it wasn't the kind of place that protected behavior like that. The lesson that stuck with the community was practical, not dramatic. Procedure protects people, and evidence forces systems to act. So here's the question. If you were standing at that door, would you have known your rights well enough to stay calm? And if you were one of the neighbors, would you have recorded quietly, clearly, so the truth couldn't be rewritten later? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that boundaries matter. And subscribe for more story times like this. Grounded, realistic, and focused on accountability.
Hey, what are you doing out here?
Sir, I'm headed to work.
Work at 4 in the morning? Where?
Moving job, about 20 miles from where I live.
20 miles on foot?
Yes, sir. I don't have a choice.
Look.
At 4:20 a.m., Officer Miles Raines slowed his patrol car and made the kind of choice that could go two ways fast. A young man was power walking along the shoulder of a main road. No sidewalk, no businesses open, no reason anyone should be out there unless something had gone wrong. He wasn't stumbling or wandering. He was moving like he was late for something that mattered. Raines didn't hit his lights right away. He paced him first, reading the situation the way cops were trained to. Direction, speed, hands, what was visible, what wasn't. His dash cam was already rolling. When he decided to make contact, his body camera came on too, because whatever happened next would need to be clean, documented, and defensible. He pulled up alongside and told the man to stop. The man stopped immediately. That alone threw Raines off balance. People who were guilty usually did one of two things. They ran or they overacted. This man did neither. He just stood there, breathing hard, sweat on his face, backpack on, hands visible, looking tired in a way that didn't feel performative. Raines questioned him. He pressed, because a person on foot at that hour could mean danger. Someone else's danger, or his own. He expected a story that didn't line up. He expected evasiveness. Instead, the man gave an answer that made Raines go quiet for a second. Not because it was dramatic, because it was specific. And it didn't match any of the usual reasons a stop like this happened. For a brief moment, you could practically see the officer's suspicion searching for somewhere to land and finding nothing. Whatever the man had just told him hit like an unexpected fact. The kind that forced Raines to reassess the entire situation right there on camera, while the road stayed empty and the morning stayed dark. And that was the moment everything shifted, because Raines realized this wasn't a man walking away from trouble. He was walking towards something he couldn't afford to lose. Where are you watching from? Country, state, city? Drop it in the comments. And if you like stories where someone stays calm under pressure and where accountability actually shows up in real life, hit like and subscribe, because this one didn't end on that roadside. That stop was just the beginning. To understand why Trey was out there in the first place, you had to understand what starting over meant to him. Trey had moved to Homewood, Alabama with his mother after they lost everything in Hurricane Katrina. That kind of loss didn't just erase possessions. It left a permanent fear of instability. Trey and his mom rebuilt carefully. No cushion, no extra. Just steady effort and the hope that life wouldn't reset them again. So when Trey landed a job with a moving company about 20 miles away, he treated it like more than employment. It was a lifeline, a chance to get ahead instead of surviving week to week. Then, on the morning he was supposed to start, his old car finally died. No warning that mattered. No easy fix. Just a dead vehicle and a start time that didn't care. Trey didn't have money for repairs. He didn't have money for a tow. And he didn't have the kind of situation where he could miss day one, apologize later, and assume people would understand. He knew how employers saw it. Unreliable before you even begin. So he made a decision that sounded extreme until you measured it against his reality. He set an alarm for midnight and started walking. Not for attention. Not to prove a point. Because the alternative felt like sliding back toward the edge he and his mom had been fighting to stay away from. As the night went on, the walk became exactly what you'd expect, exhausting. His legs burned. His pace slowed and sped up in waves. He kept checking the time, adjusting his effort, refusing to let his body decide for him. He wasn't walking for fitness. He was walking to keep his job, before he even had it. By the time he reached the stretch of road where Officer Raines found him, Trey had been on his feet for hours. He looked like someone who'd been pushing through pain for a reason he couldn't explain quickly without sounding unbelievable. And that was the problem. Because from the outside, alone, moving fast, backpack on, in the dark, Trey looked like the kind of suspicious that got people stopped. Rains followed because that was his job. He wasn't going to ignore a person moving like that at that hour and risk it turning into something worse later. But Trey wasn't thinking about how it looked. He was thinking about the clock, the job site, and what missing this opportunity would do to his life. So when Rains finally pulled up and made contact, it became a quiet chess game. Authority on one side, determination on the other. Rains controlled the scene with questions and presence. Trey controlled his own outcome by staying calm, staying clear, and not giving the situation anything it could twist into a different story. And then Trey explained why he was out there. He didn't dress it up. He didn't get emotional. He just told the truth, where he was headed, how far it was, and why turning back wasn't an option. That truth, simple, disciplined, and painfully real, was what shocked the officer. Because it meant the suspicious thing wasn't crime. It was commitment. And on camera, with the roadside quiet and the moment fully documented, Officer Rains had to decide what kind of person he was going to be next. Officer Rains kept the stop tight and procedural at first, because that was how you avoided problems later. He asked for Trey's name, where he was headed, and why he was out there at that hour. He kept his tone controlled and his distance consistent. He didn't escalate, but he also didn't relax. Trey answered the way someone answered when they couldn't afford to be misunderstood. He didn't argue the stop. He didn't act offended. He stayed focused on facts, where the job was, when he had to be there, and what had happened to his car. Rains tested the story without turning it into a scene. He asked follow-ups that would catch a lie if it existed. He looked at Trey's condition, sweat, fatigue, the way his legs kept subtly shifting like they were cramping. He looked at the phone map in Trey's hand. He looked at the direction of travel. And slowly, the suspicion ran out of places to hide. Because Trey wasn't giving the energy of somebody avoiding consequences. He was giving the energy of somebody chasing a deadline. There was a short pause where Rains clearly recalculated. His body cam was recording his face, his silence, the moment his assumptions met reality. That mattered. If he handled it wrong, it wouldn't just be a bad interaction. It would be documented by his own equipment, by dispatch logs, by any later review. So Rains made the decision that separated a routine stop from a turning point. He acknowledged the situation for what it was. Trey was exhausted, still miles away, and trying to make it to his first day of work. Then he offered a ride for the remaining distance. Trey hesitated, not because he didn't need it, but because accepting help from a patrol car at that hour came with its own weight. He understood how it could look. He understood how quickly people wrote their own stories about someone like him, but he also understood the bigger truth. This was about getting to work on time. So he got in. Rains kept it professional. He didn't turn it into a lecture. He didn't treat Trey like a suspect anymore, but he also didn't pretend the power imbalance hadn't been there. He drove, kept the route straightforward, and checked the time the same way Trey had been checking it all night. On the way, Trey gave the simple version of his life, enough to explain why this job mattered so much. He mentioned moving to Homewood with his mother after Katrina took everything. He mentioned how quickly things could fall apart when you didn't have savings, connections, or backup plans. He made it clear he wasn't looking for pity. He was trying to earn stability. Rains listened. And you could tell the story was landing on him in a way he didn't expect, because his questions shifted from suspicion to logistics. Where the job site was, what time Trey had to clock in, whether anyone there was expecting him. It was a small but important change. The officer stopped looking for wrongdoing and started looking for a solution. They pulled up near the job site with enough time to spare that Trey could actually breathe. Trey got out, thanked him, and moved with urgency toward the trucks and the early morning activity. Rains watched for a second before driving off. Not in a dramatic way, more like he wanted to confirm for himself that Trey was real, that the story ended where Trey said it would end. The body cam captured that too. The handoff from suspicion to trust. Trey reported in and got to work. No speech, no announcement. He did what movers did, showed up, listened, lifted, followed instructions. He didn't act like he had just walked through the night. He acted like he was determined not to lose the opportunity he'd fought to reach. That's when the homeowner noticed something wasn't adding up. The homeowner saw the exhaustion in Trey's face, the way he pushed through the work anyway, the way the crew reacted to him with a mix of disbelief and respect. Eventually, the explanation surfaced. Trey had walked for hours, been stopped by police, and still made it on time. The homeowner didn't treat it like gossip. They treated it like a story that needed to be told while it was still fresh, while it still meant something. They posted it on Facebook, focused on the determination, the timing, the officer's decision to help, and the fact that Trey had shown up when most people would have quit. And almost immediately, the post started moving. At first it was friends, then friends of friends, then people outside the neighborhood, outside the city, sharing it with the same reaction. Disbelief turning into respect. Trey was inside a house carrying boxes, trying to earn his first day like it was any other. Meanwhile, his life was starting to change online without him even touching his phone. The Facebook post didn't spread because it was polished. It spread because it was simple. A young man had done something most people couldn't imagine doing, and he'd done it for a reason people understood immediately. Within hours, the story was leaving Homewood. People shared it with short reactions, some amazed, some angry that anyone had to go that far, just to keep a job. Some focused on the officer's decision to help instead of escalate. And as the shares climbed, so did the questions. People wanted proof, not because they wanted to tear Trey down, but because the internet had trained them to doubt everything. So the conversation turned into accountability in real time. Commenters asked for confirmation, asked where it happened, asked if the moving company could verify he was scheduled that morning. The homeowner responded with what they had: timing, location, and the basic details of what they personally witnessed. The moving crew backed it up in their own circles. And the most important piece wasn't a dramatic video. It was that the story matched reality in ways that were hard to fake. The job site, the company trucks, the supervisor's confirmation, and the fact that Trey was still there, working instead of chasing attention online. That was when someone took the next step. A GoFundMe was created to help Trey get reliable transportation. The goal was modest at first, enough for repairs, enough for a used car, enough to keep him from ever having to make that walk again. Then the donations started coming in faster than anyone expected. $5, $10, $50. People who had never met Trey donated because the story hit a nerve. A person doing everything right and still getting one breakdown away from losing everything. As the total climbed past the goal, the tone shifted again. It stopped being just about help. It became about what kind of community people wanted to be. One that watched struggle as entertainment, or one that actually changed the outcome. Trey didn't even find out the full scale of it immediately. He was still focused on work, showing up the next day and the next, acting like the safest move was to stay consistent and let the noise pass. But the noise didn't pass. Local pages picked it up, then larger accounts. The same short summary kept circulating, and each time it did, more people asked the same question. Who was this guy, and why was he left with no option but to walk? That question reached the moving company in a way no internal report ever could. First, it hit managers. Then it hit someone higher. Eventually, it reached the CEO. And when it reached him, it didn't land as a feel-good post. It landed as a public test of the company's values. Because now thousands of strangers were watching what the company would do with the fact that their new hire had nearly walked a full marathon twice over, just to avoid missing day one. The CEO didn't treat it like a marketing moment right away. He verified it. He checked schedules. He confirmed the job site. He confirmed Trey's start date and clock in. He asked about performance, whether Trey had actually shown up ready to work, whether he had done the job without complaint, whether this was real. Every answer came back the same. Trey had earned his place the hard way, and nobody had handed him anything. So the CEO made a decision that was both personal and strategic. He was going to show up himself, not to send a message through an email, not to post a statement, to appear in front of Trey face to face and change the practical problem that started all of this. Because at that point, the story wasn't just about one walk. It was about whether the people with power, resources, and visibility would respond like human beings or like bystanders. The Facebook post kept spreading, and the GoFundMe didn't just meet its goal. It blew past it fast. As more people shared it, the moving company's name got pulled into the spotlight, and the question became simple. What would the company do now that everyone was watching? The story reached the CIO. He didn't just react online. He verified the basics, then showed up in person. Trey was still working, still trying to keep his life normal. When the CEO spoke with him, Trey confirmed what happened in the same practical way he'd been doing from the start. The car died. He couldn't miss day one, so he walked. Then the CEO solved the core problem. He gave Trey a car. That moment spread too, and it sparked the phrase people started repeating everywhere. Be like Trey. Not meaning walk 20 miles, but meaning show up, stay disciplined, and do the right thing even when it's hard. Trey didn't become a celebrity in his own life. He kept working. He used the support to stabilize things at home with his mom. The attention was overwhelming, but the outcome was practical. Transportation meant he could keep the job without risking another crisis. And quietly, the incident became a reference point, something people brought up later when they talked about dignity, assumptions, and what it looked like when a community decided to help a person who was already helping himself. In the end, that night didn't change Trey because he became famous. It changed him because one impossible choice led to a chain of reasonable help at the exact moment it mattered. So, here's the question for you. If you saw someone pushing through like that, would you assume the worst, or would you pause long enough to learn the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share the story with someone who needs the reminder that showing up still matters. And if you want more story times like this, realistic, grounded, and focused on accountability, make sure you subscribe.
Stop moving. Give me your name properly.
My name is Terrence Carter.
That's my car.
My keys are inside, man.
Quit tensing up. Put your hands behind your back.
I'm not fighting
I
you.
know that,
Run a plate.
man. That's his vehicle. He
Run a
parks here
plate.
all the time.
Run a plate. It's his car.
Stay back.
Cuffs are on.
I'm not fighting you.
Everybody, back up. Get on the sidewalk. You're interfering with an investigation.
You can see the keys inside.
Run the tag. 10 seconds and this is over.
Back up now. Everybody, back up.
He just shot in the air.
Two Detroit officers had Terrence Carter face down on the pavement, one pinning his shoulder while the other fought his wrists behind his back. Terrence kept saying through strained breaths that they had the wrong guy and that the car beside them belonged to him. The officers kept ordering him to stop moving and to give his name properly, treating every word like a challenge instead of an answer. Around them, a crowd swelled fast, people yelling that Terrence wasn't stealing anything, that they knew him, that it was his vehicle. Multiple phones were already up, lenses aimed straight at the officers' hands. The louder the crowd got, the harder the officers pushed, as if control mattered more than clarity. Before this got any calmer, more units were already turning the corner. Quick pause. Where are you watching from? Detroit, somewhere else in Michigan, another state? Drop it in the comments. And if you watch these stories because you care about accountability and what happens when authority gets it wrong, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The worst part was how normal it had started. Terrence was in his early 30s, the kind of guy who moved through the city with his head up. He'd finished a long shift and parked along a busy strip near the barber shop. He reached into his pocket, then his jacket, then checked again, twice, before he looked through the driver's window and saw his keys sitting in the cup holder. The sinking feeling hit him like a small betrayal. He tried every door anyway, all locked. He pulled out his phone and searched for a locksmith, scrolled the prices, and hesitated. He wasn't desperate enough to pay a few $100s for a mistake if there was a simpler fix. So he did what plenty of people did when they were tired, broke, and trying to get home. He tried to work the door open using a small tool he kept in his bag from an old roadside kit. And from the wrong angle to the wrong eyes, it looked like exactly what an officer wanted it to look like. A patrol car had been rolling slow across the street. Officer Grant Harlow sat in the passenger seat, scanning the sidewalk with the bored sharpness of someone hunting for a reason to be busy. Officer Dana Pierce drove, posture rigid, attention narrowing as soon as she saw Terrence's hands near the doorframe. They didn't pull up and ask if he was locked out. They didn't start with the simplest verification move, checking his ID against a registration, or just running the plate. They watched for a few seconds, built a story, and arrived already committed to it. The cruiser eased up, doors opened. Terrence heard them and instinctively stepped back from the car with his palms visible, because he knew the rules of surviving misunderstandings. Harlow told him to step away from the vehicle. Terrence tried to explain that it was his car, that he'd locked his keys inside, and that his registration and identification were inside the cabin. Pierce responded like the explanation was a trick, like having proof inside the car was evidence of guilt rather than the most predictable detail in the world. Harlow demanded Terrence's name. Terrence gave it. Then Harlow demanded he spell it, as if the spelling itself would reveal a lie. Terrence spelled it anyway, staying controlled, trying not to let his frustration turn into tone. That was the chessboard right there. Terrence needed to be believed, and the officers needed him to be obedient. Those were not the same thing. Pierce moved closer and started a quick Frisk-style assessment with her eyes and stance, looking for anything that justified escalation. Harlow positioned himself so Terrence's body was between the officers and the car, like Terrence was the problem that needed to be separated from the scene. At that moment, the street started to notice. A few people coming out of the barber shop slowed down. Two teens leaned against the wall, phones already half raised, and an older man, Leon Jackson, everyone called him Mr. Jackson, recognized Terrence immediately. Mr. Jackson spoke up loudly enough that the nearby shoppers turned their heads, insisting that he knew Terrence and that the vehicle was Terrence's. The comment should have been helpful. It should have been a shortcut to resolution. But Harlow treated it like defiance and ordered him back. Mr. Jackson didn't move back. He repeated it. His tone carried the kind of certainty that only comes from familiarity. Someone who didn't just assume, but actually knew. That was when the crowd stopped being background and became a factor. A woman near the corner store, Tasha Nguyen, raised her phone fully and announced that she was recording. Others followed. The posture of the crowd changed too. People weren't just watching out of curiosity anymore. They were watching to document. Terrence noticed the phones and felt a brief, sharp relief. Not because he wanted a spectacle, but because he understood how quickly a story could get rewritten when someone in uniform started talking first. Harlow, meanwhile, noticed the phones and stiffened. He ordered Terrence to turn around. Terrence asked why, keeping his voice level. Because he hadn't done anything violent, he hadn't run, and he had followed every instruction so far. He tried again to explain that he was locked out and that he could prove ownership if they gave him 30 seconds to do it. Harlow didn't acknowledge any of that. He repeated the order and closed the distance. This is where routine becomes a trap. A person can comply and still be treated like they didn't. A person can explain and still be accused of arguing. Terrence was trying to do the only thing he could do, use words to slow a situation that was accelerating. Pierce moved in on Terrence's left side. Harlow moved in on his right. Their positioning wasn't conversational anymore, it was tactical. The crowd started calling out specific, simple questions the officers weren't asking. Whether he had a spare key coming, whether they could run the plate, or whether they could check the registration. Someone yelled that they were making a mistake. Someone else yelled that Terrence lived nearby. The officers treated the crowd like a threat rather than a resource. Harlow reached for Terrence's arm. Terrence instinctively tensed, not to fight, but to protect his balance when someone grabbed him unexpectedly. A tiny reflex was all it took. Harlow interpreted tension as resistance. Pierce stepped in tighter, and then the situation tipped. Harlow forced Terrence down. Terrence went to the ground hard, trying to keep his hands visible, even as his body got folded into the pavement. The officers started working his wrists behind his back, while Terrence kept insisting, between breaths, that they had the wrong person and that the car was his. That was the uncomfortable truth of the moment. The crowd wasn't creating the incident. The incident had already been created by assumption. The crowd was simply refusing to let it disappear. Then sirens rose in the distance, backup closing in, and the next patrol cars arrived. 2 more patrol cars rolled in and boxed the curb. A sergeant-sized presence stepped forward and did a quick scan of the crowd. Because at that point, the crowd was the thing the officers felt slipping. The new officers didn't ask Terrence what happened first. They asked the original officers what they had. Harlow answered in short, clipped phrases, describing a suspected break-in and implying non-compliance. He framed it like a solved problem, not an open question. Terrence tried to talk through the pressure, explaining again that he'd locked himself out and that his keys were visible inside. He tried to turn his head toward the car window, toward the obvious proof. Harlow pushed him flatter, telling him to stop moving. A man near the barber shop shouted that they could run the plate in 10 seconds. One of the backup officers moved toward the crowd with a hand up, pushing people back in wide, commanding gestures. The crowd didn't rush, but they didn't scatter either. They held their ground at a distance and kept recording, which, in this era, was its own kind of pressure. Then, in the midst of this pressure, one officer drew his weapon and fired into the air as a visual punctuation mark. A message without words, back off, or things will get worse. The crowd reacted instantly. People stepped back, some in shock, some in anger. It proved how far the officers were willing to go without proving they were right. Pierce finally clicked the cuffs closed. Harlow lifted Terrence just enough to reposition him, keeping control of his arms. Terrence asked, tight voice, controlled, what he was being arrested for. Harlow responded by demanding identification again, framing it like Terrence had refused all along. In Harlow's version, Terrence was a suspect who wouldn't comply, and the crowd was a hostile audience encouraging him to resist. Terrence was brought up to his feet, still cuffed behind his back. His face was scraped. He looked toward his car, as if the car itself could testify. Harlow guided him away from it anyway. As Terrence was walked toward the patrol car, he tried one more time to explain the locked-out situation. He tried to point out that witnesses were offering confirmation. He tried to remind them that they could verify ownership quickly. By the time Terrence got to the station, the scene on the street had already turned into 2 competing stories. Inside, everything moved on a conveyor belt. Terrence was searched, photographed, and logged. He was asked for identifying information again. He gave it. He asked why he was being held. The explanation stayed broad and centered on suspicion, not proof. What mattered was what happened next. Verification finally caught up. A basic check confirmed the vehicle belonged to Terrence. The suspected break-in didn't hold. Terrence was released and no charges were filed. But the public part didn't end when the paperwork ended. Over the next day, multiple videos spread online. The department responded with a statement that leaned on what officers believed at the start. Officials said the officers thought they saw a tool being used and treated it like a suspected break-in. They also said Terrence refused to identify himself when asked, and suggested the crowd's behavior contributed to the escalation. They mentioned an allegation about someone possibly trying to let a dog loose, but from the public footage alone, that point wasn't clear and would depend on body camera review to confirm. The public reaction stayed focused on one thing: This could have been a routine locked-out situation if the first move had been verification instead of force. Under pressure, the officers were placed on administrative duty while an investigation started. That wasn't a conclusion. It was the department acknowledging the incident had become serious enough to review formally. For Terrence, the aftermath was not just physical. He had to deal with the humiliation of being arrested in front of neighbors and strangers, the stress of explaining what happened to people in his life, and the lingering reality that he had been treated like a suspect first and a person second. And then the next phase began: accountability through the system. Once the internal review was underway, Terrence's situation moved into a different arena: documentation, deadlines, and leverage. His attorney filed a civil lawsuit seeking $500,000, framing the case in broad, straightforward terms. Terrence was detained and arrested during a situation that could have been verified quickly. Force was used before basic confirmation, and the encounter caused harm that didn't disappear just because charges were never filed. The legal process immediately widened the lens. The focus shifted from one chaotic sidewalk moment to the system around it: how officers described what they saw, how supervisors responded, what policies governed crowd control and use of force, and whether the department's steps matched its own standards. Requests went out for records commonly tied to these cases: reports, dispatch logs, training materials, and video that showed the decision-making sequence. The city's response also followed a familiar pattern. Officials did not admit wrongdoing early. They treated it like an active matter: investigation pending, facts under review, legal channels in motion. Behind that neutral language was a practical reality. Once a lawsuit was filed, every public sentence mattered, and every internal record had a future audience. Meanwhile, the public reaction didn't fade the way the city hoped. People kept sharing the clip because it wasn't complicated. It looked like a relatable problem was handled as a crime first and confirmed later. That theme made it stick. Community conversations became less about Terrence as an individual and more about a recurring experience: being presumed suspicious and then told to prove you belong. That ongoing attention created pressure in places that rarely admitted it mattered: supervisors, administrators, risk managers. Internal review continued. Lawyers began preparing for depositions and formal statements. The department faced a choice it couldn't avoid forever: either defend the actions as policy consistent or acknowledge that the escalation was unnecessary and address it. By the time the lawsuit became public enough to be discussed beyond the neighborhood, Terrence's case had turned into something larger than one mistaken arrest. It became a test of whether recorded oversight could force a system to correct itself. The investigation produced a clearer internal timeline than the street ever did: what the officers said they believed, what steps they took, and what they did not do before putting Terrence on the ground. That sequence was the point. Terrence's side kept the case general and simple. A situation that could have been verified in minutes was treated as a crime first, and the harm came from escalation and detention, not from any proven offense. The city pushed back in the standard way, emphasizing officer perception and crowd dynamics. But the existence of multiple recordings limited how far the narrative could drift. Over time, consequences landed in the places they usually land. The officers did not return to the public eye as heroes. Their actions became a departmental problem that had to be addressed, documented, and explained. The administrative process continued, and the incident stayed attached to their names inside the system, even when the news cycle moved on. For Terrence, the outcome mattered less than the acknowledgement. No charges were ever filed, and that fact followed him like a receipt. His attorney used it as a blunt anchor. The arrest ended where it began, with nothing proven. The lawsuit seeking $500,000 forced the city to treat the incident as more than a misunderstanding. It was now a formal claim with records, review, and accountability pressure. In the months that followed, changes showed up in the most realistic way: in language and procedure. Supervisors emphasized verification steps earlier in similar calls. The department faced renewed attention on de-escalation, on when hands-on force was justified, and on how quickly a simple check could prevent a public mistake from becoming a public injury to trust. Terrence did not become a symbol on purpose. He became one because the situation was so ordinary at the start. Being locked out of your own car was something almost anyone could imagine. What happened after was the part people couldn't accept as normal. That was the moral the neighborhood carried forward. Power moves fast, but proof moves faster when someone records, when witnesses speak up, and when a person stays controlled enough to survive the moment and challenge it later. If you were in Terrence's position, what would you have done differently, if anything? And if you were one of the bystanders, would you have spoken up or just kept walking? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share the story with someone who needs it, and make sure you subscribe for more real, grounded stories about accountability and justice.
Put the phone down.
I have the right to record this interaction, officer.
Open all the windows. All of them.
Why do you want to open all the windows? Can you call your supervisor, please?
There's no supervisor. I'm the most senior officer here. You want me to make your life difficult? Because
You selling drugs tonight, gangbanger? What are we doing out here?
I'm not selling drugs. I'm not in a gang. I already told you who I am. I want you to see exactly who I am.
What is this? Is this fake?
The officer didn't even lean in like he was talking to a human being. He stood at Devin Reed's window and started barking over and over, telling him to put the phone down, like the phone was the real crime. Devin stayed still, hands visible, voice controlled. He told the officer the phone was mounted and recording, and that's when the officer switched to another demand. He ordered Devin to open all the windows. Devin, still calm, asked why the officer wanted all the windows open. The officer didn't answer. He mocked him. Then, like he wanted Devin to understand who was in charge, he threatened him. He basically said, if Devin wanted, the officer could make Devin's life difficult. And he said it like he enjoyed doing that to people. And in that moment, you could feel it. This wasn't a normal traffic stop anymore. This was a power play. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Country, state, city, anywhere. And if you're into stories where somebody stays calm under pressure and the truth catches up to the loudest person in the room, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this one. All right, rewind with me, because how Devin ended up in this exact moment matters. Devin Reed wasn't reckless. He wasn't flashy. He was the type of man who moved through the world with quiet discipline because his job demanded it. He was mid-30s, clean-cut, dressed plain on purpose. Hoodie, jeans, nothing that screamed for attention. The kind of guy you'd pass in a parking lot and never remember, which was exactly how Devin liked it on his off hours. That night, he'd been driving home from a long day that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with exhaustion. The kind of day where your brain feels packed with details you can't afford to forget. The road had thinned out as he left the busier part of town. Fewer cars. And then it happened. Red and blue flashed behind him. Devin didn't do what panic makes people do. He signaled. He slowed down smoothly. He rolled forward until he reached a bright open area near a gas station entrance. Devin kept his hands visible and started recording on his phone. Not in a dramatic way. Not with an announcement like he was trying to provoke anyone. And when the patrol car stopped behind him at an angle, headlights washing the inside of his car, Devin took a breath and prepared for a normal interaction. License, registration, reason for stop. Maybe a warning. That's what a normal stop feels like. Devin kept his posture calm. He didn't give the officer anything that could be twisted into a threat. And then the first words out of that officer's mouth weren't a greeting. No introduction, no reason for the stop. Just that demand, over and over, ordering Devin to put the phone down. Devin told him the phone was mounted, that it was recording, and that his hands were visible. And that should have been the end of that issue. But the officer didn't want end. He wanted obedience. So he kept pushing. He demanded the windows, all of them, like Devin's car, needed to be opened up like a display case. Devin asked why. And that simple question, why, hit the officer like disrespect. That's when the mocking started. The officer called him a little weirdo. That's when the threat came out. And Devin realized something in real time. This officer wasn't responding to danger. He was responding to being challenged by calm confidence. So Devin did the next smartest thing a person can do when they feel a situation slipping away from routine and into personal. He asked for oversight. He asked the officer to call a supervisor, and the officer shut it down immediately. He claimed there was no supervisor. He claimed he was the most senior officer. Now think about that. In any real system, police, school, job, anything, there is always someone above you. Someone who answers for what happens. So when someone says there's nobody above them, what they're really saying is they want the scene to stay exactly how it is, just you and them. No witnesses with authority, no accountability in the moment. Devin didn't argue, he got precise. He asked the officer to identify himself and state the reason for the stop. And that's when the officer's tone shifted again, like he'd decided questions were done. The officer ordered Devin out of the vehicle. Devin paused, not to refuse, but to measure his next move. So Devin kept his voice steady and asked if he was being detained or arrested. The officer didn't give clean clarity. He answered in that vague, slippery way that leaves the officer room to justify whatever comes next. And right before Devin opened the door, the officer gave him one last push to stop recording, like the recording itself was the enemy. Devin didn't stop. He made sure the camera kept seeing what was happening. And then Devin opened the door and stepped out into the gas station light. Because Devin Reed knew something the officer didn't know yet. And in about 30 seconds, that officer was going to find out. The second Devin stepped out, the officer moved in close, too close, like he was trying to shrink the space around him. The officer told Devin to turn around and put his hands where he could see them. Devin complied without sudden movements. He kept his voice steady and reminded the officer he was recording. That didn't calm the officer down. It irritated him. The officer started patting him down immediately, not like a routine safety check, but like he was shopping for a reason to escalate. The officer kept tossing out accusations, asking if Devin was selling drugs, asking if he was in a gang, trying to paint a picture before any facts were on the table. Devin didn't argue with the insults. He didn't plead. He just kept asking for the basic things that should have been simple: the reason for the stop, the officer's name, and a supervisor. The officer shut the supervisor request down again, repeating that there was nobody else to call, that he was the senior officer. And then, to make it clear he was in control, the officer said Devin was being detained. That's when the cuffs came out. Not because Devin resisted, not because Devin threatened anyone, because the officer wanted the scene to look like Devin had earned them. Devin's wrists were pulled behind him. The metal clicked, and Devin, still calm, told the officer to check them for tightness and asked again for a supervisor. The officer didn't answer the request. He went back to fishing for a narrative. He kept asking Devin what he was really doing out there, like driving at night needed an explanation. Then the officer reached for Devin's wallet. The officer opened it, flipped through, and you could feel the exact second the officer's confidence wobbled because he didn't find what he expected. He found a credential case. Devin was an FBI. He pulled it out like it was evidence. Then his voice changed. Not louder, sharper. Suspicious in a different way. The officer demanded to know what it was. Devin told him what it was. And the officer froze. He stared at it, looked back at Devin, and said, like he couldn't decide whether to panic or accuse, asking if it was fake. That's the moment the entire stop tilted. Because now the officer wasn't dealing with a driver. He was staring at a federal badge, while his own body camera and Devin's phone were still rolling, and Devin was still in handcuffs. The officer stopped talking like a bully and started talking like a man buying time. He stepped a half pace back, still holding Devin's credentials, and radioed in fast, asking dispatch to verify a federal ID. His voice was different now, tighter, careful. suddenly aware of every word being recorded. The officer didn't argue anymore. He stalled. He kept looking from the credential case to Devon's face, like he was trying to figure out how to reverse the last 5 minutes. Then a second patrol car rolled in. Officer Priya Desai stepped out and immediately read the scene. A calm driver in cuffs, one officer keyed up, and a credential case in the first officer's hand. Desai didn't match the energy. She asked what the stop was for, why the driver was cuffed, and what exactly had been found that justified detaining him. The first officer gave vague answers. Nothing clean, nothing specific. He kept it general, like officer safety, like he wasn't cooperating, like suspicious behavior. Desai didn't accept the fog. She asked for the driver's name and identification, then looked at the credential herself. And that was the moment the error changed. Desai's tone went professional and quiet. She told the first officer plainly that they needed a watch commander, not later, now. So the radio call happened, the one the first officer said didn't exist. Within minutes, the first officer was no longer acting like the most senior person in the world. He was watching his own story collapse. His voice softened. He spoke to Devon like they'd been having a respectful conversation the whole time. But Devon didn't rush to wrap it up. He stayed calm and insisted on the basics: names, badge numbers, the reason for the stop, and confirmation that the body camera footage would be preserved. That's when the cuffs finally came off. And the first officer, who had been threatening to make Devon's life difficult, switched to polite phrases, thanking him, telling him to have a good night, acting like he appreciated him. It happened because the officer realized who Devon was. Devon didn't treat the roadside release like a happy ending. He treated it like the end of scene 1. As soon as he was away from the officers, he parked somewhere public and well-lit, and did what trained investigators do when they know a story is about to get cleaned up on paper. He locked in the facts while they were still fresh. He saved the recording in more than one place. He wrote a short timeline with exact details: time, location, sequence of orders, the escalation, the detainment, and the sudden tone change once his credentials were noticed. He kept it factual and tight, because emotional language is easy to dismiss, but a clear timeline is hard to argue with. Then he went straight to the system. He requested the official records tied to the stop: body camera, dash camera, dispatch, and radio traffic, and the written report that would be generated afterward. He also filed a formal complaint through the proper channels, making it clear this wasn't about being upset. It was about conduct, procedure, and accountability. Once the complaint was officially logged and the footage requests were in motion, the situation stopped being a he said. It became a file, a case number, a chain of emails, deadlines. Internal Affairs pulled the full body cam and dash footage, dispatch logs, timestamps. Then came interviews. Krause had to explain why he escalated so quickly, why he made personal threats, why he mocked the driver, why he claimed there was no supervisor, and what legal reason justified detaining someone who wasn't resisting. And that's where it got ugly for him, because vague explanations don't hold up when video exists. Officer safety only goes so far when the driver is calm, hands visible, and asking for basic oversight. Within days, the officer was placed under a review, and his supervisors started asking the kind of questions that don't come with friendly answers. Meanwhile, Devon kept doing one thing: staying disciplined. He didn't turn it into a social media war. He didn't chase clout. He responded in writing, showed up when asked, and kept everything centered on conduct and policy: what was said, what was done, and what should never happen on a routine stop. And eventually, consequences started forming. Maybe it was suspension. Maybe it was a reassignment. Maybe it was a resignation timed to look voluntary. Maybe it was termination after findings came back. However it landed, the key point was this: the system couldn't pretend it was nothing, because the footage wasn't nothing. And the department couldn't ignore how bad it looked. That respect only appeared after the driver status was revealed. That's when the policy conversations started. The part departments hate, but communities need. Supervisors reviewing stop protocols, clearer rules about recording, stricter requirements for detainment and cuffs, mandatory supervisor notification when a stop escalates without a clear legal basis. And Devin didn't frame it as revenge, he framed it as prevention, because the next person might not have credentials. The next person might not have training. The next person might not walk away with nothing but anger. Weeks later, the stop wasn't just a memory for Devin. It was a reference point. Because what stayed with him wasn't the flashing lights or even the cuffs. It was the pattern. How quickly respect disappeared when the officer thought he was dealing with just a guy, and how quickly it returned the second the badge came out. And that's the real lesson, not be calm and it'll be fine. Devin was calm the whole time. The lesson was documentation changes outcomes, and accountability only works when there's a record strong enough to survive excuses. Devin didn't walk away thinking he won. He walked away thinking about the next person who gets pulled over in the dark, without training, without confidence, without a way to preserve what happened. The person who gets labeled before they even speak. The person who's calm still gets treated like a threat. So, he did the only thing that actually protects people long term. He forced the system to look at itself. Not with shouting, not with revenge, with facts, with timestamps, with oversight. And maybe that doesn't feel dramatic in the moment, but it's how real change happens. Quiet, boring, undeniable. Now, I want to ask you something. If you were Devin, what would you have done differently, if anything? And if you've ever had a routine situation turn into a power trip, tell your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear they're not alone. If you want more real, grounded stories like this, where dignity stays steady and accountability catches up, hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.